Good afternoon. Welcome to Dakar Academy, to our parents as well as our guests and staff members. And today we have the privilege of Phil Carr, the Nazarene missionary in the area and parent to two daughters that attend our school, contacted me and said that he had Dr. Duane Spaulding visiting from the U.S. and would we be interested in having him come and share with us on Ebola and maybe some other pertinent health issues. And I said, of course we would. And thank you, Phil, for making that offer. And I'll have Phil Carr come up and present Dr. Spaulding.
In 2001, our family moved to Colorado Springs, and it was there that we met Dr. Duane Spaulding and his wife, Dr. Mary Spaulding. And we discovered that they were passionate. They were passionate about life and about ministry and about the Lord, and they were really warm, engaging people. They lived in Colorado Springs. One of his passions is riding his bike at 6,000 feet and up the hills and down the hills, and his wife likes climbing the 14,000 feet mountains, and she had us out there climbing those. Dr. Duane Spaulding spent 26 years in private practice in Colorado Springs, but he also worked with hospitals and treating people in the hospitals. He took early retirement, and he has offered his services in volunteer missionary service in different locations. He's been in Central America, he's been in Haiti, in that area, he's been in West Africa, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Liberia. He's been in Kenya. He's been in Southern Africa. And he will talk, well, maybe he won't talk too much, but he, for the last 2.5, 3 years, he's been coordinating the clinic ministry or the clinic services of 12 different clinics in Haiti after the disaster there. And so even while he's at our house, he's been coordinating the deployment of new volunteers from the States and workers there from Haiti. He and his wife has a PhD in philosophy and Bible literature, and she will be leading a study on our transformation in Christ, bringing the outsider in, and it'll be this weekend, Friday evening and Saturday, if you're interested in that. But Duane, often he comes in support of what his wife is doing, and that is the case here. And when he gets through with this week here, we're going to be going to Gambia, and when he returns from there, he's going to be going and deploying back to Haiti. It's a great privilege. He's a man of passion. He's a man who's fun. He's got a lot of good jokes. He's probably not going to tell them today, but it's a privilege to have him, and I'd like you to help him welcome him.
Thank you, Brother Phil. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for attending. I know it's not the most fun, obviously not a joking situation with what's been going on in West Africa. And so appreciate your being here. I'll try my best to explain some things that hopefully will allay some concerns, but also give you the opportunity to ask some questions that I'll do my best to answer for you as well. So what I thought I'd do first off is go through basically an overview of Ebola. With all this and the access to the internet, I understand many people may have already accessed some of that. Some sources on the internet are more reputable than others. I've tried to access the best ones, including just this morning, new articles that were published that give us some updates. I won't go into great detail, but I'll give an overview and the things that us as concerned citizens, visitors, expats, parents, teachers, lovers of the Lord need to know to take good care of ourselves and our families. So without further ado, let me go ahead and talk a little about what's called Ebola hemorrhagic fever. EHD is the abbreviation for it. Sometimes you will see EVD, Ebola viral disease, and sometimes some other abbreviations as well if you're reading. Ebola was first identified in 1976 in what's now the DR Congo. At that time it was Zaire, near the Ebola River. That's where it gets its name. It's among the most virulent, that means the most dangerous, most severe disease-causing type of virus ever discovered. The family is called filoviruses. There's another virus called Marburg, named after Germany, where they discovered it as they were doing research on African animals, and a number of them got ill. So Marburg was the first one recognized, and then Ebola in 1976 in what's now DR Congo. There's 5 different strains of it. One of them is the Zaire version. There's other ones from Sudan and other names based on where they were found. And the maximum death rate approaches 90%. Thankfully, if we can be thankful for anything about Ebola, this illness, this disease in West Africa is more in the 55%, give or take a little bit, mortality rate, meaning in the range of 45% of patients do survive. And that's important to remember when we talk about treatments, because it's not that everybody's going to die without the perfect treatments that don't yet exist, but we'll talk a little about that. The transmission of this disease has been a big question, especially where did it come from? Where has it been? Why did it just now show up in West Africa? And there aren't perfect answers, but the best information we have is it's probably fruit bats. They carry rabies, as some may know. They carry other kinds of illnesses, and there are actually situations in Uganda where a woman from Colorado, where we live, was coming out of a cave she'd been exploring, and a bat brushed her arm, and she got a viral hemorrhagic fever in the same family as Ebola. They've done studies on some of the bats and have found it in them in different varieties. So they're saying it looks like it may be a resident virus that mutates in these bats and doesn't kill them. So how do humans get it? The best information is probably most likely from bush meat. For example, chimpanzees or gorillas. But keep in mind, they also die of Ebola for the most part. So they're not a long-standing reservoir. They suffer and die ultimately as well as humans too often do. Bats don't seem to. So that's why we classify the bats as a reservoir. An intermediary can be chimpanzees, gorillas, other non-human primates, as we call them. The human-to-human transfer of it is almost exclusively direct contact with bodily fluids. That includes blood, sweat, saliva, urine. Also, most of these patients, we'll talk about symptoms in a minute, may have vomiting and diarrhea. Both of those are contagious, but only contagious from sick patients. Meaning all the studies are showing patients who have Ebola are not shedding virus that's contagious until they themselves have symptoms. So if you're sitting next to someone who's feeling just fine and 5 days later they come down with Ebola, there are no studies at this point that show they were contagious at that point 5 days earlier. Once they have a fever and the other manifestations we'll talk about, then there's true reason for concern and they are contagious at that time. How does a person themselves get contaminated? It's basically the most common is contaminated hands of the individual who's not sick. Comes in contact with either with a small laceration in your skin you didn't even realize you had, or you reach up and rub your eye, nose, in your mouth, suck on your fingers, lick your fingers to turn the page, whatever. And it's unprotected mucous membranes, and that just means the ones I've just described are examples of mucous membranes. And it enters the body through any of those routes. It can also be from needles or other things like that, or blood transfusions or other things from contaminated blood to someone who didn't have it. But it has not been shown to be airborne in the usual way we think of airborne. There are some nuances. I won't bore you if someone says, well, wait a minute, there was one case. I can address that on the side later. But for this discussion, there is no standard way of airborne where, unlike influenza, just being in the same room, most people in the room, or measles, who haven't been vaccinated or otherwise immune to it, can contract it just from being in the same room of someone with measles. If it were that way, this epidemic would be far worse, many more cases of it than we've seen now. So that, as well as the research from the CDC, that's in Atlanta, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, but they just abbreviate the first 3 letters, CDC and others, have shown no evidence that it's airborne in the usual sense that we all think about. It may live on inanimate surfaces, and this is the part, when I'm researching the literature, still, you'd think we'd have precise information. The ones I've seen is about 3 days. I saw one article said maybe a number of days longer than that, but whatever, the virus certainly can live on dead patients' bodies. And that's where we hear about some more aspects of this that I'll talk about. So it may live on inanimate surfaces, whether it be contaminated bed sheets or clothing of someone, a caregiver who's been taking care of someone, obviously mattresses and other things like that, which has happened in Liberia, one of the reasons that they got into the quarantine issues in West Point and all that, if you've heard about it. Anyway, there is no evidence that mosquitoes transmit it. Again, if it were mosquitoes in these parts of the world, there'd be far more cases if mosquitoes were transmitting it from person to person. Basically, the ones who have it, you can trace who they were exposed to. It just doesn't pop up in the middle of nowhere that, hey, how'd they manage to get it? No, if you do the history carefully, you can find the source of it. And that's really important to know. So sometimes you hear the term here that it's described as not a highly contagious disease. Well, that's not necessarily reassuring to people who say, wait a minute, you just touched somebody who has it and I don't consider that not highly contagious. They're being purists in the epidemiologist sense of the word, meaning it's not like measles or influenza. That's not to say there's no risk of contagion. It's just different than some of the extremes. Okay, but for the rest of us non-research epidemiologists, we're not necessarily reassured by that information, I understand. The West Africa Ebola outbreak. It basically is the Zaire species from 1976. It seems to be very, very closely related to that. Remember I said there were 5 different strains of it now, worldwide, that have been identified. And it's basically, for all intents and purposes, the Zaire version. That started, when they look back and backtrack, in late 2013, but it wasn't really identified until the first quarter of 2014 that, whoa, this is Ebola hemorrhagic fever and not Marburg or some other type of contagious disease that people were dying of. It of course has spread to Liberia, which unfortunately is the worst affected. My wife and I had just worked there as volunteers in November, December of this past year. We're also in Sierra Leone, have many friends, physicians, pastors, lay people, and they're all struggling with this in these countries. Liberia the worst, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, I believe now the report is 22, but they're all able to be traced to the Americo-Liberian who went from Monrovia, Liberia to Lagos, Nigeria, and unfortunately became ill and collapsed and died. And the doctor and the nurse who primarily cared for him have now died. I believe 6 or 7 have died from it. They all had contact. It wasn't even people on the plane didn't contract it. It was those who were healthcare givers who were intently involved in helping him as he died that were at risk. The numbers, unfortunately, at this point, and these are almost week old, and as of midday today, they still haven't updated them. I'm kind of surprised. But anyway, the official numbers are about 1,550, and round numbers have died, and a little over 3,000, I think 3,069, have been positively affirmed as having Ebola. But the World Health Organization, quote, said that this is, quote, vastly underestimating the number of cases. I hate that word vastly when you're talking about something like this. But having worked in Haiti where some of the areas that government thought there were 1,200 people living and there were actually 17,000 living in the mountains with no idea, so when cholera struck in the mountains of Haiti, they're reporting X number of deaths, and we say, yeah, we know 30 out of 36 people from this one congregation up in the mountains couldn't get to a clinic, they collapsed along the way, and were never counted. So the numbers are, instead of 8,500, are probably in the range of 20 to 50,000 in Haiti of cholera deaths. We will never know because of so many uncounted individuals. And similarly in this situation, when they get the sense that it's vastly underestimated, I take that seriously. The 2014 epidemic, just on the numbers they're publishing, is now the worst ever. In fact, they're saying it's as bad, it's worse than taking all the previous epidemics and adding the numbers together. It's actually more than that in this West African outbreak. So the reasons for getting it, how did this happen, where did it come from? And they're doing epidemiologic, tracing it back as best they can to the, as we call it, sentinel case, where it first appeared in the human population. Factors include preparing and eating improperly prepared bushmeat that I mentioned earlier. By the way, proper cooking kills the virus, but it's the butchering and preparing that can be the risk, where they're preparing didn't realize, and you didn't get your hands washed. You may not even have soap, like I found in so many places in Haiti. We have to teach them basic hand washing techniques with soap, believe it or not. More densely populated areas as compared to DR Congo, where several of the cases have occurred before. They're in isolated remote communities, and no pun intended, the illness dies out. I hate to use that terminology, but you understand what I mean. The people who have it aren't highly mobile. They stay in that area, and the virus quits spreading because they're not going to other areas. But West Africa is much more densely populated and more mobile, especially in the large population centers. One brother got sick in Upper Guinea. Nobody realized that's what he had. He got sick, was dying, and ultimately his brothers took him to Conakry, his 6 brothers. He died, not knowing what it was. They all helped take care of his body, which includes, as part of the grieving process and the funeral process, handling the body and preparing it for burial. All 6 brothers developed Ebola and all died. Now they're in the middle of a city of 2 million, and it's gone on from there. Some of the first cases identified were somewhere right in the confluence of Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, as they're tracing backwards. And it's very porous borders there. With the civil wars and all that, people move back and forth across there for commerce, for whatever. And so, again, more mobile societies across these borders. Lack of appropriate patient isolation, including families that don't want their family members isolated, or in Freetown, where they get really upset, or even worse, Monrovia, where they've gotten upset that they tried to isolate them. Inadequate supplies of PPE, that means personal protective equipment, if you run across that in your reading. That's those head-to-toe impervious gowns that they have to wear, with duct tape around the wrist to protect, etc., with gloves and a full suit on. You all heard about probably all of you heard about Dr. Kent Brantley and Sarah Wrightball, the 2 Americans who developed Ebola, the first Americans to have it to contract it in Liberia. Dr. Brantley, just to give you an idea, was working inside these impervious suits trying to save patients' lives as a volunteer for Samaritan's Purse, Franklin Graham's organization, for 3 hours at a time, and they've checked the temperature inside, and it averages at least 120 degrees inside these suits for 3 hours. It can't breathe, it's not vortex, sorry. You're just sweating, so you're drenched with sweat, you're dehydrated. You're probably a little bit woozy after 3 hours of intense work trying to save these patients' lives and trying to take good care of yourself and not accidentally pierce yourself as you're starting the IV and puncture your glove or whatever. But when you come out of that suit in this proper sequence, you're coated with water that can easily spill out and contain. If you take your glove off incorrectly, after you've taken one hand out, you go, whoa, got to get this one off. And if you hold it with this index finger on the outside, as you pull it off, you just contaminated your index finger. I mean, it's so easy to do it when you're working as a healthcare worker with Ebola patients. So you have to slide underneath and get it off. I mean, it's just all these steps that have to be followed to a T, and if not, you're at risk. And so the healthcare workers, approximately 240 healthcare workers by the latest numbers, have been stricken with Ebola. The lead physician in Sierra Leone and Liberia are both deceased. There's a major research article that's about to be published with a Canadian and 5 West African research physicians, and the 5 West Africans are already all deceased from Ebola. It hasn't even come out, it's not off the presses yet. It's been submitted for publication. The one Canadian lost all his colleagues, all his co-workers. It's yet to come out for the medical community to read. So those are lack of PPE, as I say, and lack of adequate treatment centers where there's no place to properly have these patients and care for them. MSF, which is Doctors Without Borders, we think of it, but it's the preferred name is Médecins Sans Frontières, which is MSF is the abbreviation. They built a treatment center for 180, and within days they were totally overwhelmed and said they need beds for 800 more. This is in Liberia. For 800 more, they can't put the facilities up fast enough, nor can they find enough personnel and supplies to staff what's really needed. So there's some, again, those are issues there. Skepticism about authorities. You know, this is more repercussions from the civil wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone in particular, that there's distrust after 14 years, schools shutting down, et cetera, in Liberia specifically, for authority, and then misinformation, unfortunately, was promulgated on some of the radio stations from sources I'm not sure of, but physicians reported back to me about what dysfunction that was causing when misinformation was given. They don't trust the healthcare workers, they're not sure, the rumors start, and people believe that if you go to a healthcare facility, that's where you get Ebola. So if you're suspected, stay away at all costs. Well, then your family's caring for you, and there's real risk there. The rituals, as I mentioned, of many relatives handling the bodies of the deceased patient. This is another risk that's cultural to this part of Africa in particular, and exposes the loving family members grieving the loss of their loved one, which turns out to be Ebola, highly contagious, on the bodies. And they're all exacerbated by a lack of frequent hand washing, and yes, even soap. Clinical manifestations. First of all, incubation. That is from the time the virus, you're exposed to the virus to the time you develop disease. It's a broad range, and that's a challenge. It's 2 to 21 days. So 2 days to 3 weeks is the maximum incubation period. Beyond 21 days, they have not documented anyone who has developed Ebola, which means you're in a safe zone at that point. So what are the symptoms? And I tried to think of a way to remember these. So I'll do a little acting out for you that you can share with others who might be interested, if you please. And no, this isn't meant to be funny. So basically, we'll do a visual on it. And I guess I'll do it behind the microphone here a bit. But anyway, the visual is, I'll point up, and that means high fever. Okay, severe headache, okay, vomiting, I'm working my way down the body, okay, high fever, severe headache, vomiting, okay, muscle pain, abdominal pain, diarrhea, exhaustion. And the last one, that's less frequent but very important, is bleeding or hemorrhaging, which could be from anywhere, okay. So I'll do it one more time. So it's high fever, severe headache, and these come on acutely. The high fever, severe headache, vomiting, muscle pain, abdominal pain, diarrhea, prostration, exhaustion, malaise, weakness, hardly able to move, in other words, is the term you might use, and then possibly hemorrhaging. If patients are destined to die from this, as we follow the patients along clinically, this constellation of symptoms are worse in them than other patients who are, shall we say, destined to improve. As they follow them, not knowing what the future holds, they carefully document, how can we tell who is in worse condition than the next patient in the next bed? Those who are dying usually progress to total organ failure, meaning lungs and kidneys and liver, etc., stop working. And septic shock, meaning that their blood pressure collapses, they have infection in their bloodstream, and it's no longer life-sustaining. They're not able to live with all that despite the best efforts at supportive care. If they survive, they begin to improve about 6 to 11 days after the onset of their symptoms, after that fever begins. 6 to 11 days, if they're destined to survive, they'll start turning the corner, so to speak, and start improving. But it's a very prolonged recovery with marked weakness, exhaustion, difficulties regaining the weight that they lost while they were so acutely ill as well. And many patients who die, just as an aside, die of dehydration. A minority of patients, it's not even 50%, it's something in the range of 25 or 30%, the best numbers I've seen, have died because of their bleeding. Although people hear it so, when you're bleeding from your eyes and your ears and your mouth and every orifice, it terrifies the family members, and understandably so. But that's a minority of patients that die that way, in that terribly ugly way of dying. But that's what makes all the headlines, so to speak, among families, communities, and regions. But most die from dehydration. And some die because nobody was willing to or did not have access to the PPE, the personal protective equipment, couldn't start the IVs, didn't have access to IVs, whatever it is, that the dehydration from the vomiting and diarrhea is what took their lives. That they could have been some that survived, and they're, doing the studies right now to find out who among these patients who get the ideal care in a healthcare facility versus substandard care, how much impact, substandard because there was no choice, there was nothing available for them. Doing the studies of how much of an impact does that have on their survival. In the Marburg virus outbreak that they had some years ago, a sister virus, those who were in Europe that developed it, 23% died, and the ones that were in Africa, way over 50% died, 60-70% died. So they said, okay, even though there's no cure for this illness, if we support them in every way possible, we can help more of them pull through. So what are those treatments? Attempting to prevent additional exposure of families and others around is number one in your treatment. Don't forget to also be trying to prevent your healthcare workers, their families, everybody you can identify who might be at risk. Have that in the front of your mind at all times as you're working on saving that stricken patient's life. As I mentioned, rehydration in IV fluids, as well as to maintain their blood pressure. It may require transfusions if they're having coagulation problems that cause them to hemorrhage from every place. What we call symptomatic treatment, meaning transfusions if we need to, and a variety of other things to keep them comfortable, trying to keep them cool from their high fever, using appropriate medications, even as simple as acetaminophen, paracetamol, also called Tylenol in the United States. Just efforts to help soothe and control some of their most miserable symptoms. There's what's called post-exposure prophylaxis. That's different than vaccines that I'll come to in a minute. What's a post-exposure prophylaxis? That means a person has been exposed, known to have been exposed, and there are treatments that are now being used experimentally to try and help. You may have heard about ZMapp, Z-M-A-P-P. Comes from a company called MAP International, or MAP Pharmaceuticals, I believe, in San Diego. It's manufactured, of all places, in tobacco plants in Kentucky, in some greenhouses. But what it actually is three, what we call, without getting too technical, monoclonal antibodies. What these are three, you know what antibodies are, they help fight off infections. And in the case of a viral infection, by definition, antibiotics do not work. Antibiotics only work for bacteria. There are a few viruses that can be treated with antivirals. That includes HIV, that includes hepatitis C, and some other kinds of, zoster, herpes zoster, and herpes simplex. Some of those can be treated with true antivirals, but not antibiotics. In the case of Ebola, none of the antivirals or antibiotics in the classic sense work for them at all. However, the ZMapp, those three monoclonal antibodies, each one of those antibodies attacks a part of the capsule of the virus. And in a threesome, they kind of gang up on the surface of the virus and prevent it from being able to attach to a cell and inject its RNA, its genetic material, and start the whole process of duplicating itself and then spreading to other cells, killing that cell and spreading to other cells. So ZMapp, with these three monoclonal antibodies, was first tried in humans when they shipped it from their research primate and animal studies, shipped several samples to Monrovia, Liberia, to inject into the Americans, and actually a Spanish priest. So, just a quick aside, Dr. Kent Brantley, before it arrived, had said, I want you to give the first dose to my colleague from SIM, Nancy Wrightwall. I want her to receive the first therapy, first injection, because if there's any hope, I want her to have first option. Well, in the meantime, he actually was losing a lot of ground. They were afraid they were going to lose him. And so his treating doctors overruled him and gave him the first dose. And a preliminary report was that he started to turn the corner. In other words, he was slipping, and they were greatly concerned they were going to lose him. That he started turning within an hour. Now that's pretty quick. It hasn't been studied and proven yet, so we have to still say it's unproven, and please don't say, oh, it's the cure-all, because I didn't say that. But he did start turning the corner. You know, we believe in miracles. He's a Christian man, a man of prayer, people all over the world praying for him. So there's many other factors that we weren't able to measure, and it's still being studied in each patient who's received it. But please understand, it's still purely experimental. So he received a dose, and in fact, some days later, was able to be flown to Emory University in Atlanta. He was strong enough when he got there, shocked everybody, including his doctors, to actually, in his biohazard suit, climb out of the ambulance and walk into the hospital when he'd been on, so to speak, death's door. So we'll take it as a positive, but we don't want to spread misinformation that it's a cure. They also gave it to Nancy Wrightwall, and she's recovered. Both were dismissed from the hospital about a week ago, and both are recovering that prolonged recovery phase I talked about. However, a third person received it, a Spanish priest. He then was transferred to Spain, and he didn't make it. And keep in mind what I said about 55% mortality rate, that means 45% without something like ZMapp survive. So we don't want to jump to the wrong conclusion, but we are encouraged. The monkey, chimpanzee, monkey studies and the like have been very encouraging, exposing them intentionally to Ebola and then treating them afterwards. Even as long as 3 days after exposure, they were prevented from getting the disease, while others were, the control group all died of Ebola among these monkeys. So it is encouraging, but what works in monkeys doesn't necessarily work the exact same in humans, so I don't want to give misinformation there. And I can answer other questions about that. There are several others. There's siRNA that throws a wrench in the works, and once they're in the cell, so when they're trying to produce proteins, the virus, it so to speak, throws a wrench in there and the mechanisms that allow protein production and stops it. So as a result, that prevents the virus from perpetuating and multiplying, etc. But then there's also vaccinations. And a new vaccination is just starting to be tried within these several days here. I've been traveling, so I haven't seen everything on it, but there is a vaccination that they're also trying. They'll obviously have to use it, for instance, in healthcare workers, other people at higher risk, because if you just do it in the general population, you may have to vaccinate hundreds of thousands of people, and they don't have that many to do it. So they may focus on those at highest risk and see if they can prevent it with these vaccinations. Stay tuned. People say, well, why don't they use for instance, ZMapp on everybody? They've used up all the supply they have. I think they had 6 or 8 supply of, and they've given it to several other people in Africa. Liberian doctors, several of them stricken with the illness, have also received it. But the word from the MAP pharmaceutical is all their supplies have been exhausted. They were created to be used in research laboratory. They said it will take several months to produce even somewhere in the range of 30 to 50 more doses. Yeah, so they aren't geared up for this type of use yet, but there is hope, and obviously full court press to try and get there. So most important in infection control and prevention. Number one is, as I mentioned earlier, soap and water. Yes, and probably after this meeting, we probably also should avoid shaking hands. And I know Senegalese culture and most of our cultures, that's something that we do unless we're from the Far East or other places. But we should seriously consider. I always carry hand sanitizer in my pocket, but that's not the panacea. but avoiding shaking hands during this time would be advisable. I'll leave it to you, but it's a suggestion that we all ought to consider. If a person is sick with symptoms that are like the ones I talked about, you shouldn't touch them. That also is kind of difficult. If they're a family member, that you shouldn't touch them if they have this excruciating headache and fever. And when I say high fever, in centigrade, it's more than 38.6, and in Fahrenheit, it's 101.5. Okay, if you're looking for what kind of fever are we talking about. So it's not just, oh, I'm a little bit feverish, you've got a significant fever. So if a person has these types of symptoms I've talked about, you should get them to the nearest treatment facility and try not to be in contact. Call the ambulance if you have that available in your community. Most places I work overseas, we don't. Avoiding bushmeat, hopefully we're okay there. Stopping rumors, because misinformation can be so terrifying to people and then makes them more skeptical about true information when it comes out. Wait a minute, somebody else said such and such, now who do I believe? So if you hear rumors that don't match up, do your best to allay those concerns and identify those as rumors and try and stop it from propagating. And do not panic. You know, right now there's one person in all of Senegal with 13.5 million people, one person, a university student, as you probably all know, from Guinea, who had direct contact with family members, one of whom died. They had him under surveillance. They're watching all the contacts to be sure if they develop symptoms that they immediately take appropriate action for suspected Ebola. He disappeared off the grid on purpose and then showed up in Senegal. They tracked him down, notified Senegal from Guinea. We lost track of him. Meanwhile, his sister and his mother both died after he left, and arrived in Senegal in an apartment, and then after a few days got sick, went to a hospital, and they tracked him down there and said, "You're sick, we're testing," and he was positive, unfortunately, for Ebola. So an irresponsible 21-year-old has brought this dreaded disease to within our borders here in Senegal, unfortunately. So because they identified him at an early stage, they have been working very, very carefully, and understand a briefing from as recently as a couple hours ago from the U.S. Embassy indicates that we're getting excellent cooperation between the CDC and the Senegalese government, Department of Health, hospital officials, all those in positions of authority and responsibility for this situation, to track all contacts for any signs of illness and immediately take appropriate action. Because again, as I mentioned, you're not contagious until you have symptoms. So that in monitoring, that's why they're checking people's fevers as they leave the airports, other things like that these days, because it's only at that point where there's reason for extra concern. So tracking all contacts is an important part of this. Being sure that all healthcare workers have PPEs and know the procedures to get in and out of those pieces of equipment, even if you're drenched with sweat and exhausted and dehydrated. And even working, this will be a tough one, to change funeral practices, especially out in the remote areas, because it is a factor, unfortunately, for these patients. And the vaccination, as I mentioned earlier, experimental but is being tried. Again, some primate studies are encouraging. There are many other diseases, unfortunately, and these are, so to speak, the unintended consequences or the spin-off consequences from this dreaded disease. There's other diseases that mimic Ebola, especially at their outset in the early stages. For instance, malaria. Sometimes typhoid can mimic Ebola. So as a result, unfortunately, especially from personal reports to me from my colleagues in Liberia specifically, and I'm sure it's happening in other places, but I know specifically in Liberia, without adequate protective PPEs, I'll call them, as you know, and appropriate testing to rule in or rule out, is this Ebola, hospitals and clinics are shutting down. Several of their workers have gotten sick and died in some cases. They're just so terrified of this illness, and they don't have the protective equipment. So unfortunately, the patients with malaria that's very treatable, and with typhoid that's very treatable, are literally dying and are not part of these statistics because the healthcare facilities have shut down. Workers staying at home, refusing to work without appropriate protection, I can understand that. But then patients with treatable diseases are also losing their battle with their treatable illnesses as a result of the Ebola epidemic, I'm sorry to say. You may have read that there's, just in the past couple of weeks, an outbreak of Ebola in DR Congo. So far, I believe they've had 13 deaths. But what they're saying, the latest I saw that today, is that the virus is somewhat different from the West Africa one. They've been able to find no contacts that had anything in common between traveling between West Africa and this remote area of DR Congo. So they're at this point stating it as a completely separate outbreak that just coincidentally happens to come on the radar at the same time we're dealing with the West Africa version of Ebola at this point. So stay tuned on that one. Our hope and prayer would be in the case of West Africa, of Zaire, now DR Congo, is that this strain will in fact be contained in that small area, not travel across borders with all the challenges they've had with their terrible political instability in the eastern part of the country, et cetera, and that it will be isolated there. Meanwhile, the CDC and especially World Health Organization, they published a couple days ago that there could be as many as 20,000 cases before this runs its course. Right now they're predicting could be 6 and even 9 months before it's really contained, but it will take cooperation at all levels of government and all levels of individuals and patients and families across these countries to actually be able to effectively rein it in because of how it spread and some of the local traditions and skepticism about it. So for all of us, take-home message is we need to be informed. We need to be appropriate about the information that we share with others, working to, shall we say, squelch the rumors and that, to not panic, and yet to be observant of appropriate precautions and encourage each other, pray for each other, and especially pray for the healthcare workers and those dear patients all across this land that are suffering. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to do my best to answer some questions. Question, Jessica?
Some of a positive case, where do they go here in Senegal? We know that. Yes, they go to the, well, they're treated at the Fan Hospital, but we're recommending in the protocol that you contact your family physician as soon as if you have a high fever so that they can do the first screening. And
I'll repeat the question was, where do you go here in Senegal if you have symptoms suggestive of Ebola? And our leaders giving some answers of possibilities, including seeing your primary physician if you have any suspicious symptoms like I've described, and some other things. Go ahead and use the microphone.
I just got back from the medical briefing at the U.S. Embassy that was for embassy staff, but they were gracious enough to invite me along. And one of the great things is that we have the Pasteur clinic here, and they are doing the majority of the testing for West Africa, and they have the latest equipment and the latest training. So that's where any samples would go to be tested. And again, because you don't know when the first symptoms come, whether it's malaria or not, we're recommending you contact the family physician, and then they will direct you from there. But Fan Hospital is one of the main places they take care of infectious diseases there. Also, the embassy was assuring their personnel that, and there was a Ministry of Health person at this meeting, they are working side by side with the CDC. CDC people are already here, and they're pretty impressed with the medical infrastructure that is here, which is much better than Sierra Leone and Liberia and some of those places.
Thank you. Did that answer your question? Okay. Next. Yes, ma'am.
I saw something on the news a couple days ago. This is not even good, but we talked about a company that has a bunch of experimental medicines that they would give away for free. Do you know if they ended up being able to disperse that somewhere?
Right, and I don't know, I heard something about that and haven't seen any follow-up. One comment on experimental medicines. Think about, I'll just put it this way, think about the 3 doses that were given. We don't know of ZMapp, we don't know for sure that it works, and what happened with the Spanish priest. But once you give an experimental medicine to in a culture where they're skeptical about authority, etc., and the patient dies, now they die because of the injection. Even if it was ineffective or whatever, if they die after the injection, it caused their death. And so the political and other ramifications of experimenting during an epidemic is fraught with a lot of downside. Huge amount of downside that could have ramifications for all kinds of things in the healthcare arena. We're all desperate for a rapid prevention and cure. Prevention for those who don't have it and cure for those who do. But it's so tricky to launch an investigation in the midst of an epidemic because of those kinds of risks. Just an FYI on that part. So when companies are promising, saying we'll release this experimental for free, I'm also just generically, I'm not pointing to any company because I honestly don't even know the name of the companies, although I read something in passing about it. I'm just reluctant to grasp at straws and say, yeah, let's go for it. What do we got to lose? Actually, we have a lot to lose if we're wrong, or especially if it is killing people. You're experimenting on us Africans. What do you think you're doing, you Westerners? Again, there's a lot of those kind of tensions that happen post-colonialism. People haven't forgotten how things went. And movies, etc., The Constant Gardener, other movies about pharmaceutical companies experimenting on unsuspecting Africans. And it's happened in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and other things as well in the US with syphilis in Black American men. So we definitely don't want to, shall we say, feed into that kind of situation where we just exacerbate the skepticism and even outright animosity against healthcare or what's trying to be accomplished. Yes, sir.
Just a follow-up question, Commissioner Rosa. I understand you said that contact a family doctor, you like in the States or family doctor? Because
You mean here? Contact your local physician here in country.
Like Boogaloo? Yes.
Dr. Boogaloo, is it? Something close to that? Okay, all right. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I wasn't here at the very beginning, but I'm wondering, how long can the virus last outside of the body?
Okay. As best we know, in the range of 3 days, maybe longer. So those who have died, it's still infectious on their bodies as they're preparing the bodies for burial and the like in their body fluids. At least 3 days on inanimate objects, whether it's a dead person's body that's no longer alive, or sheets, bed sheets, or mattresses, or other things contaminated as well. And that's all we have right now. I'm looking for better information, but the best I could find was at least 3 days. Yes.
I'm just curious if you could recommend, like if we as a community were to support the physicians who are working in Liberia, first of all, who would those people be? Would it be Doctors Without Borders probably, or Samaritan's Purse? Because I'm thinking, all of us who have kids, probably every one of us has a kid who did the whole ice bucket challenge for ALS, which was enormously popular and pretty effective. But I think both to do something proactive, but also to combat the panic and the instinct towards self-preservation, it would be a good thing if our community could do something.
Right. So the question is how to mobilize support for this outbreak, as has been done with some others, like the bucket for ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease, sometimes called, that have been so amazingly popular with a tipping point. Last I heard, $53 million raised for research on ALS from this silly little thing of dumping an ice bucket over your head and the like. And it's gone viral, so to speak. Oh, that's a bad one for talking about Ebola. Sorry about that. From my personal view, faith ought to be part of the equation. Without naming names, not all organizations are faith-based, including some of the biggest ones in Liberia, Sierra Leone. I have great, great respect for what they do, including in Haiti. But when people are, no pun intended, scared to death, they need a spiritual aspect addressed too. And that doesn't happen in all organizations. So my personal encouragement would be to look for organizations that are faith-based, faith-friendly, whatever term, but have no problems with sharing faith with frightened, terrified patients and family. Praying with them, sharing with them, loving them, sharing the Lord's compassion on them, even as they feel like pariahs, including those who survive, are often, the reports are now coming back, seen as pariahs in their own communities. So now they not only went through the arduous ordeal of Ebola, but now that they were one of the 45% that have managed to recover, they're not welcome back home. They're considered outsiders. My wife's going to talk about outsiders, but they're considered outsiders. We don't know how long that will continue. But having a faith community and that to come alongside them in those situations is something to think about, to give them hope. In my work in the hospital, taking care of hospitalized patients, one of the things I liked about it, appreciated about it, compared to my office practice, is people sick enough in the States to be in the hospital, it's a wake-up call about your mortality, that you're not going to live forever, that we have vulnerabilities health-wise. They were much, much more amenable to my approaching issues of faith, what I call faith flags, asking if they would like to have the chaplain come and spend time. I only chose the evangelical pastors to come and pray with them. And over they said, oh, that was so helpful. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That rarely happens in an office practice where you're looking after the blood pressure and the diabetes and the, managing multiple medical conditions as an internal medicine doc. But the wake-up call of being in the hospital opened the door for many opportunities to reach out in ways that they otherwise would have been closed, honestly. Well, this is certainly one of those situations when you're dealing with a life-threatening and potentially life-ending illness, that it's a major wake-up call to things beyond this life for patients and families. So a number of organizations, I mentioned Samaritan's Purse, Dr. Wright-Ball worked for, SIM, Nancy Wright-Ball worked for. By the way, there's now a doctor from SIM that has HIV, just reported in the past couple days. They haven't said a lot about it. We need to be praying for all of them. And there's a number of other faith-based organizations that are involved as well. So I'd encourage you to look for those in particular. And I appreciate your question and your desire to help mobilize for this cause, because you're right. Many organizations, including the World Health Organization, so to speak, are screaming for attention. Come on, rest of the developed world, you must come alongside us and help in this desperately needy situation. In 2010, for 4 million people, there were 51 doctors in Liberia, in the whole country. Now I hear the number's 37 for 4.3 million. Yeah. So, desperate needs for that, and we can, anything we can do to facilitate, in particular, the faith-based response, I think, is the least we can do, and thanks for asking that. Yeah.
Do you know how early someone can be tested positive for?
Question is, how early can you be tested? Basically, once you're symptomatic, there is virus that's being shed in your body. That's why it's now contagious once you're symptomatic. And the test that they have, there's a number of different ones, PCA and ELISA and all these different ones, but they can detect the RNA or the markers for the virus, the RNA virus, in test samples with their specialized equipment. So basically, by the time you're contagious and symptomatic, you can be tested and ruled in or ruled out. In other words, told yes or no on having Ebola. So, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I have two questions. The first one is just a clarification. Is the only place that can handle the, containment and isolation the Fawn Hospital? And if so, So that's question 1A, and B of that question, how many beds do they have in that containment area?
Okay, so wondering, and we'll let Mr. Rosa answer, wondering how many beds are available and if that's the only facility at Fond Hospital.
Michelle, I thought I had read that there was maybe another facility. Do you recall?
I'm sorry, I don't have the information on this one. Is it Grand?
If there's more than just the Fond Hospital that
I did
is
say
set up?
maybe Grand York. Maybe Grand York, but I'm not sure.
I know that, that another location, another country, they have portable tents so that they can expand the number of beds. It was re-emphasized today in the meeting that Dakar is far better prepared to deal with this than any of the other countries. Nigeria has more infrastructure, but they don't have the political backing to tackle it. Here, the government is putting everything they have behind it to follow up. There are actually approximately 75 people that they are monitoring. Half of those came into contact with the Guinean student through the household and that type of thing. The other half are medical personnel that either attended him when they thought he had malaria or later. And I asked the representative from the Ministry of Health, okay, so surveillance, what does that mean? Are they just watching them move around? They said, no, those people are isolated, and until they pass the time limit and show no symptoms. So that is, that's reassuring.
And what I understand is they're checking their temperature twice a day, and it's for the 21 days from the time they were exposed. So yes, go ahead. Part 2?
Sorry. So how many beds do they have in Fond? Do they approximately?
Oh, we don't have that information.
Okay. The second part of the question is the sports question. So if I saw the health protocol that not supposed to go out, in big, large gatherings of people. So when our kids play full body sports, like say soccer, and there's bodily contact and there's droplet possibility with sweat, saliva, and those kinds of things, what does that look like?
The best reports and guidance that I've seen, guidelines that I've seen, is that anyone who's ill should be kept at home.
The problem with that is we can do that with all of our kids, but if we're playing a team that's a city team, they're not doing that with all their kids.
We could communicate with their leaders to be sure that they're doing the same before they play, if there's any question of it as well, and there may be other individuals. That's right. The indications are not too many will be playing with 101.5 fever, but your point's well taken, and you'll have to use your own discretion on that. Again, there's only one patient out of 13.5 million at this point, but that's not to say it's zero. We hope it will soon become zero when he hopefully recovers. The last I heard, he was improving, this Guinean student, university 21-year-old student, and hopefully none of the others develop it, but they are being ever so closely monitored per protocol for any symptoms of that. Wouldn't it be wonderful if it's the one case and that's it, and after 21 days from the last exposure of anybody unprotected, there's no more cases? That'd be fantastic. We don't know yet, but we hope so and pray so.
One of the things is that we have spent, the administration have spent hours and hours and hours of discussing and researching and attending meetings at the embassy and so forth. And we want to keep the school as normal as we can. We want to provide the fullest education that we can, with also taking the precautions. And that's why Monday, Ms. Van and I were up here demonstrating hand washing to the elementary students. And then we did it with the middle and high school students. And we did it yesterday with the national staff. I have the cleanest hands, I think, in the room. I have been washing them, singing happy birthday so long. And that, again, Dr. Spaulding said that is one of the primary preventive methods. It came up again at the embassy. But we are continuing to monitor this on a daily basis. If things, I told the dorms they couldn't go to the soccer game Friday. That wasn't a very popular decision probably, but we decided it wasn't worth the risk. At this point in time, we've asked Josh to notify the coaches that we're not going to do lots of shaking of hands with the other teams. Yes, there's going to come into contact, but tell me if I'm right. Even if an Ebola virus got on your hand, if you don't have a cut, if you wash that off, that destroys the virus. But if we were having if we start getting secondary cases and more cases, we'll do more evaluation. I would like to give Sharon Rosa, my wife, a minute to talk to you about, because as we're talking about the best way to keep our entire community safe, and Dr. Spaulding, will you be around a few minutes to maybe answer some individual questions? But part of it is keeping our kids emotionally safe, and Sharon wanted to address that.
I just want to quickly reinforce a couple of things. You parents have a tremendous amount of power right now. We are working very hard on trying to get the kids to go into kind of a no-touch type of a thing where they're staying away from handshaking and that. But water bottles are crazy. Kids, especially this time of year, they need their own water bottles. They need to come with them full, and they need to refill them in their drinking fountains. One of the worst things that you can do is send your child here with a giant jug. Those jugs get passed around, and that's a terrible thing. So we want to eliminate that. The other thing is as we are changing our policy, we try and get them out to you, but you can always go to RenWeb as well. We've got it on RenWeb in both English and French. And anytime we make them change, we'll load that directly up there. But you as parents can really control that a lot. The other thing is I just talked with Josh, and we're going to, in addition to talking to other coaches about we're not going to be handshaking, Josh is also going to talk to them, simply say, if you have sick players, just don't bring them. If they're not feeling well, don't bring them. Now, if you think about yourself, if you had 101 fever, you probably wouldn't even want to get out of bed. So I don't think we're going to be running that much of a risk, but we'll take that step as well. But you as parents can certainly help us out by reinforcing the hand washing and the water bottle piece. Okay, thank you.
And I want to very quickly piggyback on what Mr. Moulet has said. I think all of you who are parents or have students are thinking, how can we help our kids through this? What are they hearing? How are they feeling? How can we reassure them? And so I just want to address that, and I'll try to be really quick, and I won't say everything I have written down here. But as far as teenagers are concerned, I can tell you, they think we're all overreacting, all right? The touchless hug is stupid. The high five is ridiculous. What else would we expect teenagers to say? They're teenagers, okay? That's okay. Let them think that we're ridiculous. But let's try to get them information. And you know, teens have a way of thinking. You remember that, was it Will Rogers said, when I was 13, I thought my dad was the dumbest person on earth, and it was amazing how much he learned by the time I turned 21. Who was it? Mark Twain, sorry. Anyway, get them information that they will accept. You know, if they don't want to listen to you, don't make them listen to you. Say, here, look at this from the CDC. Or another excellent, I don't know if you would agree with this, doctor, but another excellent source that we have found is SOS International. They have an Ebola page, and every day they have multiple updates on the news there. So let your teenager get some information from a source that they might have more respect than they do for us as parents. And state clearly your expectations. It's not your job to convince them. It's your job to make sure they do them. Okay? You don't have to convince them that they should sing happy birthday to you or twinkle twinkle little star while they're using soap and water. They don't have to believe it, they just have to do it. Okay? So just do what you need to do to get them to do it. Don't argue with them. Remember at every level that kids who have had trauma in their past or difficult thing in their past are going to tend to be more anxious and fearful for this, okay? If you have a child that's gone through an evacuation, I will tell you, he's not worried about Ebola. He's worried about having to leave his friends, okay? So address that, be aware of that. With middle schoolers, just remember, they don't really care about anything but their friends, okay? So have a party and do something cool, teaching them all how to do their hands or whatever, you know, get their friends involved. If they think it's cool because their friends are doing it, they'll do it. I mean, we have to deal with reality here. Remember that middle schoolers, some of them are abstract in their thinking, they can conceptualize, others are still very concrete. The doctor was such a marvelous educator today. He used some abstract things, he used the concrete, he just didn't say, watch out for bodily fluids. He was really concrete, named them all, right? That's what we need to do with middle schoolers on down, okay? We can't expect them to necessarily understand what concepts we're trying to communicate without being concrete. And for middle schoolers, particularly for all of our kids, it's important to model their behavior, okay? So I'm a big hugger, okay? And when kids come in my office, once I've established whether they like a hug or not, if they like a hug, they get a hug. When they come in, when they leave. Adults too sometimes. So, you know, I'm there. Oh, isn't this stupid? But you know I love you, okay? I'm not going to, if I don't model it, doesn't matter what I say, okay? If you don't model it, and it can even be a joke, you know, Joe and I have already joked about how we're both going to die of Ebola together because we're not modeling it at home. Elementary age children are definitely concrete thinkers. The important thing to remember about them in addition to that is they, unlike middle schoolers, do pay attention to you. Elementary and preschoolers, they will not be traumatized so much by what's out there as what's happening to you. If you are fearful, if you are anxious, if you don't know what to do, if they see those things in you, that's what's going to affect them, okay? So it's really important that you make sure that you've taken care of yourself, and I'll talk about that in a minute. With elementary kids, well, with all kids, as the doctor said, you need to check out the rumors. We had a wonderful mother who sometime this past week, I don't know when it was, called and said that she heard a rumor that somebody on campus had Ebola. Her child had brought that home. And she did the right thing. She called the office and said, is this true? We will never be upset when you call the office and say, is this true? All right? And that, as he said, in avoiding panic is one of the best things you can do for your kids. Check out the rumors, get them the facts. Remember that preschool kids and kindergarten kids and sometimes first grade kids are still in magical thinking. All right? They don't know why you're mad. They just know you're mad. It just happened magically. They don't know why you're sad. They just know somehow the magic happened and you're sad. And so you have to remember that as you're dealing with them. Now what about us? Since we have to set the tone, What do we do with all these fears and anxieties? And I'll be honest with you, I'm 65 years old. What am I doing in a country where I might catch Ebola when I have brothers-in-law and other people in the States saying, come home? And some of you have experienced that too. So what do we do with fear and anxiety? Well, the first thing we need to do is to name our fears and be specific. The hardest thing to deal with is generalized anxiety. It just sits there and controls our attitudes, our thoughts, our behavior. Okay? Be specific. What am I afraid of? Am I afraid that my house help is going to bring Ebola into the house? Am I afraid that my child's going to catch it at DA? Or in my case, am I afraid that I'm going to catch it when I buy fruit at the fruit stand? Okay? And that's the one I'm going to use as an example because that's one of my fears. Should I stop buying fruit at the fruit stand because I might catch Ebola? Okay, so then number 2, you name the fears. As many as there are, name them, be specific, because you can't deal with generalized fears. The second thing is you get information. All right? So I heard that a lot of the fruit sellers are from Guinea, and a lot of fruit comes from Guinea. So that's part of the reason why I'm afraid. All right? I need to check that out. I need to get more information. Thirdly, I need to do what I can. What can I do? Well, you're going to laugh at me Saturday morning. Joe and I always go for a walk in the park, and then we stop at the fruit stand across from Mary Market, and we buy our fruit. I am going to have on rubber gloves as I pick out my fruit, because I'm one of those crazy 2-bobs that doesn't let them pick out my fruit for me. I pick it out myself. I'm going to have rubber gloves on. And I'm going to put the fruit in the bag myself, and when I get home, I'm going to take it out with rubber gloves. I'm going to throw those bags away, and of course, immediately, I'm going to disinfect the fruit. If you think I'm silly, that's fine. It's what I need to do to deal with my fear. So I won't have to be afraid to get my fruit. Okay? You name your fear, you get the information, you do what you can do, and number 4, as the doctor so well said, is faith. We trust God. We trust God with the rest. Name your fear, get information, do everything you can, trust God. If your kids see you doing that, the legacy of this particular dangerous time will be a good one in the life of your family.
I just want to leave with you that we are very concerned about the safety of your children, about the safety of our staff. That is in the forefront of our thoughts and our hearts. And we will continue to put the time and energy and hours. I have another meeting with OSAC, which is a security organization made up of NGOs and the U.S. Embassy Regional Security Officer. So I'll be meeting with them tomorrow, getting even more information. And we will, as Dan said, we will update you on any new protocols that we have. They'll be emailed to you as well as put on the web. It's a team effort. So if you have concerns or you have thoughts, please don't hesitate to come and talk to Dan Millay, to myself, to Barb Van Stratton, to Paula. And we are meeting regularly. We have been meeting as an administration team, and we're forming the crisis management team with pulling in people, expertise from other areas that are not on the administrative team, and we will be reviewing our policies and all of that. And as Sharon said, and Dr. Spaulding said, faith. You know, we can take this before the Lord. And next week, we're going to look at having a special day of prayer to pray for Senegal, Dakar, about Ebola. We'll get information out to you. We won't take a day off school. We'll integrate it into the day, but we'll get that information to you. And I like what the EMs have been sharing with us, Mike and Mindy on Kylie, if you've been following her journey, and where let's see what God's going to do next. Watch what God's going to do next. I mean, I think it's a miracle that there are no secondary cases at this point in time. Don't you, Doctor? I mean, within 2 days, people can start showing symptoms. So that's a miracle. And this can be a real chance for us to witness to our non-Christian brothers and sisters. We had a great time sharing with our national staff and showing them that we're concerned about them and praying with them. Yeah.
One of the things that we did that we're recommending to everyone that you can do is to buy thermometers for your household. The digital thermometers are $1,900.
Yeah, 2000.
And make sure that you have a maid, if you have a gardener, other people, they may not have the resources to have a thermometer of their own, and you can provide that, and that will serve their families as well.
And we have, Paul in the office has a little pictorial the booklet that Alexia Fall emailed us that's pictures and basic French that you could give to your house help. We'll be glad to provide you with one of those if you want. You just see Paula about that, and we could have it ready for you at the end of the next day. And there's also the little hand washing sign demonstration that you could leave with your maid so that they could take it home and practice that. So there's different things like that that we can do. I'm going to close in prayer. I want to thank Dr. Spaulding again for coming and sharing with us. I appreciate what you're doing, and Phil for sharing him with us. And thank you all for coming. Let's pray, and then if you have some individual questions, you can approach Dr. Spaulding or myself. Lord, thank you that you said that troubles would come, but that you would be with us in those troubles. And Romans 5 says that in the Message version that we won't have enough containers to catch your blessings that you pour out as we come to you and trust in you in the midst of troubles. And Lord, we bring this Ebola, a very serious trouble before you, Lord. And we know that believers are suffering and unbelievers, and we know that the church is suffering in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and as well as Guinea and Nigeria. And Lord, with Ebola here in Dakar now, it's brought it even closer to home. And we just pray, Lord, that you would give the medical people wisdom and knowledge even above what they normally have, that you would suppress this virus here, and that you would help us to be trusting in you and help us to do our part and help us to keep our eyes and our faith focused on you, Lord. Pray that you would continue to use Dr. Spaulding and his days here in Africa, and then as he goes and serves in Haiti again. We pray all of these things in your name. Amen. Thank you again for coming. If you do need a paper copy of the protocol, Paula has those. She's in the back here. She can give you one in English or French. Thank you again.